The smoke lay flat along the Canadian River, and the brush held the night like a closed fist. A rider waited in the cottonwoods, reins looped on a gloved hand, eyes steady on a shack where a lamp burned low. The man inside had killed twice and boasted he would never wear iron again. The rider on the bank had come farther than any warrant ever asked, wearing a ragged coat and a week's worth of dust, because out here a badge only mattered if the man behind it kept his word. When the door opened and a figure stepped into the yard, the rider moved. He walked in slow, spoke a greeting in a voice the outlaws' cousins used, and never raised the Colt until he saw the man's hand twitch toward a pocket. That was how Bass Reeves worked, calm, patient, and very sure. He had not been born to a badge. Reeves entered the world in 1838 in the Arkansas border country, enslaved to a planter whose politics and business pulled him into Texas as war drew near. Bass grew tall and strong and learned horses the way some men learned books. He learned to watch faces. During the Civil War, he broke from his owner. Some swore after a fight over cards, others said under cover of a patrol's distraction, and ran for Indian Territory. There he found shelter with Cherokee and Seminole families, worked their fields, hunted their rivers, and learned enough of their languages to trade, joke, and ask for help without a translator. When the guns went quiet and the federal court at Fort Smith reached its arm across Indian Territory, Judge Isaac Parker needed men who could ride that reach to its end. In 1875, a deputy named James F. Fagan recruited Reeves into the U.S. Marshal service. The badge turned light in his hand. He could not read or write yet, so he memorized the names on his warrants and the faces attached to them. He learned the bottoms his fugitives favored, and the ridges they crossed when the law drew close. He carried his papers in his hatband and checked each name out loud to a clerk before he rode. His work began where the red roads broke apart. From Fort Smith he pushed west with a wagon and a cook, a stack of warrants, and a posseman when the job needed one. The country did not care about the ink on those papers. It cared whether a man could ride through sleet, sleep little, and sit a saddle for days without losing his temper. Reeves worked the Canadian and Deep Fork, the Cimarron Breaks, the Blackjack Thickets. He crossed into the Chickasaw and Choctaw nations and back again, calling on chiefs, talking to traders, and stopping at lonely stations along the trace. He became famous for patience and for ruses that sounded like tall tales until men saw them work. Once he dressed as a tramp and shuffled into a camp where two killers sat at a fire, asking for a bite and a place to warm. He told them he was hiding from a hard-riding deputy. They laughed and let him sleep. At dawn, he had their guns in his hands and their wrists tied with their own belts. Another time, he left a wagon wheel just short of sound and let it complain down the trail until the men he hunted came out to help. They bent to the hub and found his pistol waiting. Word spread that he shot left-handed and right-handed, that he could knock a tin can out of the air 4 times before it touched dirt, that he refused liquor on the trail, and that he never cursed a man even when that man tried to cut him from the saddle. Stories grew on him because the work piled up behind him, more than 3,000 arrests over 3 decades, with 14 men killed when they forced him to choose. He brought in bank thieves, horse runners, whiskey sellers, and men who swore they would die before stepping inside a courtroom. The man did not die. He walked in with Bass beside him and kept his head down while the clerk read the charge. He carried himself like a still Sabbath. Dark hat, neat mustache, boots that stayed oiled even after a week of weather. He spoke soft and watched hard. He listened to mothers who said their sons had chosen foolish company and gave those sons a chance to climb onto the wagon without irons if they would hold to the bargain. If they ran, he ran them down. If they went for a gun, he shot straight. He prayed in private. Not every mile came clean. One night north of the river, his Winchester fired as he cleaned it in camp and struck a cook in the neck. The man died before dawn. Reeves set his badge on a table and told the court to try him like any other. A jury heard the witnesses, weighed what they knew of his careful ways, and cleared him. He picked up his star and rode out again. The hardest warrant he ever served carried pain no court could measure. In 1902, word reached him that his grown son, Benny, had shot and killed his wife in a rage. Bass asked for the paper. He said a deputy who made other fathers surrender their boys had to do the same when the law came to his own door. He found Benny near Muskogee and rode in slow so the town could see it done. The boy watched his father dismount and understood. He handed over the pistol and climbed into the wagon. Later, when asked about it, he said only that the law had been served. The territory taught him to read without a school. He read tracks, wind, and the way a camp sounded when a man pretended to sleep. He read caution in the angle of a hat and guilt in the set of a jaw. He worked for a court that had to make law stick where state lines did not, and whiskey money ran thick. Reeves showed that a warrant could be as steady as weather. Statehood changed the lines. In 1907, Oklahoma joined the Union, and the federal court that had governed the nations shrank. Reeves left the Marshal service after 32 years and pinned on a city policeman's star in Muskogee. The badge weighed less, and the streets were short, but he walked them like a man still at work. People said crime slowed on whatever block he patrolled. The lungs that had carried him across the territory began to fail. He kept walking until the breath would not carry him farther. He died in 1910 with his hat on a peg and his boots close by, and for a long time the country let the dust settle over his name. Stories lived in family rooms and in sheriff offices where old hands told young men about a deputy who never showed off and never backed up. Later, writers called him the real Lone Ranger, a title meant to pull a white myth toward a black truth. He did not need the borrowing. He left his own name pressed into the long road from Fort Smith like a horseshoe mark. What lasted was the picture of how he worked. He rode long and kept his word. He learned the land by its water and wind, and he treated people like owners of their own dignity, even when he carried them to a cell. He moved through a time when the law wore one face for some and another face for others, and he forced it to keep both eyes open when he stood there. He practiced a different arithmetic. Miles ridden, names remembered, lives taken only when there was no other way. When the river ran low in late summer, the crossings showed red mud and old wagon ruts. Cottonwoods shivered under a sky so wide it made a man small. Somewhere out there a rider once paused, tipped back his hat, and checked the wind. He had warrants tucked in his band, and a camp waiting downriver, and a wife at home who prayed over his meals and his miles. He nudged the horse forward. The brush closed over the trail and gave him up again half a day later with 2 men tied to the tail and a third riding sullen beside him, hat in hand, the road to Fort Smith almost kind. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.